I oh yes, you're controlling the slides, aren't you? Can I get the next slide, please? In this talk, I was going to discuss empowerment, what it means, and how it is that it's important to children and young people. And we heard that very eloquently this morning from Izzy, didn't we? But I guess the focus of my talk is how can we strive to achieve this in the clinic? What can we do that actually leads to change, and consider approaches that might help, and I have some examples of things that we've done in our clinic. Next slide, please. So I guess the first question is, we're talking about empowerment. What does that mean? A few years ago, the word empowerment was a bit of a buzzword. It was floating its way around and people were saying it. But I didn't really know what that meant in context of someone who's a young person with asthma, or indeed any other condition. And so we did a bit of work. We did some focus groups. We did some reviews of the literature, and we kind of came up with this framework where basically we think there are three key elements to being empowered: being able to tailor your condition around your life and not the other way around; being able to take part in shared decision making, which I'll come on to, but also being able to self-manage. And all three of these are things that are absolutely crucial. Around the time that empowerment started becoming a buzzword, people were thinking of innovation and technology as a way of achieving this. And every week I was getting an email from someone saying, oh, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? And I've tended to stay away from them, because unless it touches on at least one, if not two or three of these aspects of empowerment, I don't think it will make any difference. And we said, when we wrote this paper that we published in Archives, we also said that many innovations don't tackle a tangible problem of relevance to patients. And we said that any innovation in asthma should be co-developed with children and families. And I still maintain that that's key. I'm going to pick up on the shared decision making, if I may, for a second, because I think this is something that we have talked about kind of doing across the health service for some time, you know, moving away from a paternalistic approach to medicine to something a bit more real. And part of the reason we needed to make this approach and write it down was because I was doing everyone's head in my clinic, particularly the asthma nurses, because pre-doing this, the way that I would involve children in shared decision making was, and I still think this is quite cool, but I can understand why everyone kept getting irritated, was that this was in the days when we had paper notes before we were electronic, and I would sit there in clinic with a teenager and I would open up to the last clinic letter and I would give them a pen and I would say, you must have inhaled steroids, right? That's not on the table, but you can cross off anything else that you don't want. And they all got better. They crossed off pretty much everything else and they got better. But that's a slightly haphazard and risky way of doing things. And so the approach to making shared decisions really is about bringing shared information from the person and their family and from the healthcare professional in terms of identifying what the issues are, how they affect their life, and what are the barriers towards achieving that person's goals, really. How does asthma get in the way and what can we do about it? And we think through both medical and non-medical approaches, which I'll come on to in a sec. And then the final thing is really about tailoring that care around that person's life, not around when and how we do clinic or who we have on what day of the week, but how do we tailor what we do around what people need. So that whole process of shared decision making is something that's been really important in our clinic. On the next slide, please. I think I just wanted to talk through some data. Apologies to any of you who may have seen this last weekend at the European Respiratory meeting in my talk there. That talk was about health inequalities, but it's very relevant, I think, to empowerment. So this is my wonderful team with whom I work. They're a fantastic multidisciplinary bunch of experts, and they really are experts. And in my mind, it's a world-class group of people to work with, and so I'm very privileged and honoured to work with them. I mentioned the empowerment things that we talk about in clinic, but this is the mantra of our clinic and has been the mantra since we started our difficult asthma clinic in 2016. Asthma care is 33% inhaled steroids, 33% self-esteem, 33% healthy living, 1% everything else. Okay, so this isn't all about biologics, even in a severe asthma clinic. This is about empowering children to live their best life and fulfill their potential. On the right of this slide, I just want to talk you through this. It's something that we're pleased to share and something that we're proud of. So our clinic in Liverpool covers a large part of the Northwest and North Wales. We've had at any given time we've got about 100 odd kids in the severe asthma clinic, and the vast majority of them are poor to some degree. So around 60 to 70% of our kids come from the most deprived quintile, and each year we look back through their letters to see how controlled their asthma is. And what we moved to in 2020-ish was we said, well, what are the features of excellent care? And excellent care, we've said, is data-driven in the sense that you take data that you know about that child or young person who's sitting in front of you, evidence-based and person-centered. In other words, empowering to people. And if you look from 2016 to 2020, you see that each bar shows the proportion of children who have asthma control that year, who attain asthma control, or put it another way, whose asthma goes into remission. And the red bar shows the proportion who got well-controlled asthma in the poorest quintile. The blue bar is everybody else. And since we started that process of data-driven, evidence-based, person-centered care, which we do in an annual review format, we just set the goals or kind of share in setting the goals for the next year. We found that we have absolutely closed that gap. Okay, so we eliminated health inequalities in our clinic of people with severe asthma by pushing these approaches. Nothing else changed in that time. This is what we do, and so this approach here of bringing empowerment into our approach has been a crucial aspect of closing that gap. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the annual review, and I won't go through everything in here in detail. I just want to describe an approach to asthma that does achieve that reduction in inequalities and again, helps children thrive. And we have a fantastic clinic where, as with all young people, some of them are fantastic and really well, they're all fantastic, but some of them achieve a lot, some of them don't, some of them are really frustrating to be around, some of them are really lovely to be around. It's just a group of adolescents, isn't it? But we take the same approach to everyone. And in the middle of this, you see the square with the sort of schematic here. We draw out pretty much every appointment. We draw out the pathophysiology of asthma with these children and their parents. And we talk about the airway lumen. We talk about how people with asthma have problems there. We talk about subtypes of inflammation, and we talk about airway narrowing, both in terms of muscles and mucus. And based on whatever it is that we find, we take actions. And so the assessment is quite structured. So we're always, every time, we're asking about diet, sleep, exercise, pollution, housing, vaping, and secondhand smoke. We check once a year that we've done the flu vaccine, that we've given, that where we think that there might be infective triggers, that we've looked at functional antibodies, and we want to know their pattern. And if they're uncontrolled, as you can see on the bottom in the grey boxes, we have a clean air clinic where we see children for whom outdoor or indoor air quality seems to be driving their asthma. We take other actions, but Importantly, we've now started saying any child with severe asthma who's also got a documented food allergy has to be seen jointly with an allergist at least once, if not more, which is timely given Karen's excellent talk before. We think about their inflammation, and we talk about what we know about their findings, and we try and personalize care based on whether they've had bronchoscopies, full blood counts, whatever, and we decide treatment based on what we know about their inflammation pattern. We were early adopters of the MARC regime. We've been doing it since about 2017, 2018. That's been our standard of care. And we have found that of all the children referred for a potential biologic, we were able to get control and discharge them from a severe asthma clinic by putting them on ICS MART. It's been one of our key things. And then we think about exercise challenge, we think about breathlessness, and we go down other routes as needed. But the point being that in order to empower people, you need to make decisions based on what you know about that person, and that's not just medical or social things, it's both of them together. And this has been the key really to reducing the inequality or eliminating inequality in the clinic on a social basis. Next slide, please. We are about 2015-16 we started having a psychologist in the clinic, and I think that's really good, but having a psychologist in the clinic doesn't absolve us as healthcare professionals from delivering care that is respective of or respectful towards adolescent development, and this is something that we see a lot of in the clinic, and it's something that I think is not really that integrated into our services in terms of how we approach cognitive development. And I have two slides about two key things. So the first is the brain just develops in a different way. So as alongside social development, where peers become very important, we start seeing that adolescents think in more abstract ways, they become more introspective, and for some people that then leads to high levels of sort of anxiety. In other people, it leads to risk-taking behaviour, and things aren't black and white to adolescents. So a traditional approach to medicine is not enough to explain to them why we're doing something or other. We have to acknowledge the uncertainties about this sort of stuff, and the peer and social development becomes absolutely crucial here, because now as a 45-year-old man, nobody's going to listen to me unless I've got a really strong, solid argument. They will listen to their mates. And so that's an area of asthma care that we should really be pushing and driving forward. So that's one thing to think about with development in adolescence. On the next slide, we should have another thing. Now, this might be a word that you've not come across. It's reasonably new, but I think it's crucial. And we've recently put in a grant about how do you poverty-proof the NHS, and we're specifically bringing this element in. What liminality describes is a state where you are neither one thing nor another, or a state in which you can flit between two things. So this is our lecture theatre in Alderhay, or one of our lecture theatres, and I took this photo one evening on my way out of the hospital, and it was empty, and I knew that within hours we were having a conference the next day where it was standing room only. Okay, so that room looks empty but will be full, and that's really that concept of liminality is what we see in children and young people with diseases like asthma and allergies, where you can look really good but you can fall off the edge of a precipice very, very quickly. You're never entirely well, and you may become very unwell. And when adolescents are in that type of state, they strive in essence for normalcy. They want to be normal, inverted commas. They want to be the same as their mates. And that becomes really important to us. And the best example I can think of this is Pinocchio, the boy, or the puppet who wanted to be a boy. But when he's a boy, he's not actually really a boy. And that's a similar thing with acute on chronic diseases. When you're well, you've always got the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. And it's really important that anything that we do to empower children and young people with asthma is about saying, you are you, and this is an added consideration in your life. We need to be fundamentally clear that we do not define children and young people who have asthma as being, and I hate this word, asthmatic. They're not asthmatic. They're children and young people who have a life who happen to have asthma. On the next slide, I think we move on to what the role of technology can be with this. Again, apologies to those of you who may have seen this in Vienna last weekend. This was in a talk about digital determinants of health, and I think it's really key that we think about that. If you look at digital sort of access, which we come on to in the next slide, there's a tendency to say, oh, these are young people, let's give them something Bluetoothy, let's give them something technologically advanced. And okay, I get the rationale for that, but if we start to think about why this might not help us, particularly in asthma, a disease that has a socioeconomic gradient, both in terms of the risk of developing asthma and the risk of having asthma attacks, and as we've heard this morning, the risk of dying from asthma, it's really important that we think about what drives inequality when we try and do something. So I think there are two key things about the inverse care law. The first is that it's something that really affects the most vulnerable people, and what we know about vulnerability through history is that the people who have the least are less likely to get out of a difficult situation. We see it through history. We saw it during the plague. We saw it in Titanic, when Titanic was one ship that hit one iceberg, and yet people traveling in third class were 3 times more likely to drown, even though they were all in the middle of the sea together. And we certainly saw it during Hurricane Katrina, where the richer people could leave New Orleans and go somewhere else. And we saw it during the pandemic, where the digital divide became a stark reminder of the differences across our country and how they impact on children and young people, particularly those in deprivation. The inverse care law itself says this: the availability of good medical care tends to vary inversely with the need for it in the population. In other words, the people who might benefit the most from something are the least likely to benefit. And another way of paraphrasing that by the same person, Julian Tudor Hartley, said, to the extent that healthcare becomes a commodity, it becomes distributed like champagne. The rich get lots of it, the poor don't get any of it. And I think that that is a really important thing to recognise as we're we heard this week that on the basis of the Darzi report, the NHS is going to digitalise, it's going to become more digital, it's going to become tech, and we just need to be cognizant of the fact that the people that would benefit most from that happening are going to be the people at the sharp end of the digital divide. And on the next slide, I do sort of sum up some of the key things about the digital. Oh no, maybe I come on to that after this slide. Again, sort of thinking about the same sort of thing, not necessarily digital, but in terms of interventions that we take to try and help children and young people live their best life. I think it's important to just say that socioeconomic deprivation is in and of itself disempowering. It takes away the choice and the opportunities that children and their families have to access healthy food, to breathe clean air, all of these kinds of things that they deserve to have. And we should be sensitive to this when we make recommendations. Not everybody can afford quinoa, and not everybody has the opportunity to heat food with anything other than a kettle. So any sort of wider approaches we take to healthiness are going to be impacted by this. Hence a lot of work that we're doing around how do you address that and how do you poverty proof your whole system. And poverty proofing your system is an empowering thing to do for children and young people. This was the learning that we did. One of the people in our team is Claire Hepworth, who's in my mind, well, in everybody's mind, she's one of the world's leading physiotherapists in terms of asthma and breathlessness and exercise. And we did an approach a few years ago, a Health Foundation funded pilot project where we basically just had community approaches to getting kids to do sport, PE, football, yoga, all this kind of stuff. And we see that kind of coming out. You know, people are now starting to do things like that, which is good. But what we did find, if you look at the mechanisms by which poverty leads to inequalities, we could see that in the playing out of our work. So we know that families are priced out of giving their children a healthy lifestyle if they're living in difficult circumstances, and so that leads to worse nutrition, worse sleep, less access to exercise, which leads to worse asthma. We know that these adverse exposures don't just happen in isolation, they play off each other, and that's why, and I did see Rosamund's face pop up before, that's why it's really important that we have advocates pushing for clean air across the system. You can't just get one thing better and assume that everything will get better. Well, these things play off each other, and the best example I give is that if you look at the children in Liverpool who breathe the most polluted air, they're also the children who sleep in the worst houses, on the worst mattresses, and those would be the very children that would benefit from excellent nutrition, but they're the least likely to be able to access it. And again, this feeds in to the idea that their asthma, or it feeds into their asthma being worse, and they would be less confident in accessing the programme. Again, we've talked about the inverse care law, and we know that there is a pathobiology associated with poverty. We've done some work showing that in our region, basically the poorest half of the clinic have higher pheno and worse obstruction, and all of this then impacts children's ability to benefit from a programme. On the next slide, I think we're coming to the end. I mentioned the digital divide before, and this is a huge thing to think about because most opportunities to empower children are moving forward going to be digital, and the digital divide, the economic, educational, structural, infrastructure, geography and demographics, the very things that lead to the digital divide in terms of access, skills and engagement are the very things that lead to poor outcomes in asthma as well. So yes, there are practical things that we can do with tech to improve and empower children's lives, but we just need to be careful that, that these things don't widen inequality. And the next slide, I think, should be my summary. That's right. So to pull all that together, empowering children and young people with asthma is about us as healthcare professionals and the systems in which we work, helping people tailor their condition around their life, not the other way around. These aren't asthmatic young children, young people. These are young people who happen to have asthma. We have to promote self-management so that they're not relying on us. It's disempowering for people to rely on us when they can manage themselves, and we have to enable shared decision making. Alongside this, the most empowering thing we can do that's in our gift is deliver excellent care, data-driven, evidence-based, person-centered care. And when we are seeing children and young people, we have to be respectful of the cognitive development and the stage of their life that they're going through and the difficulties that they're having. And when we're seeing families, we have to respect the fact that they have their hands tied with what they can achieve. And again, what's within our gift is to poverty-proof our services such that they don't themselves become disempowering to families, rather than helping children live their best life and fulfill their potential. I think that's the end of my slide, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the panel in whenever that is.